For over 100 years, the American Ethical Union has been inspiring ethical communities for a world that is democratic, compassionate, just, and sustainable. I'm Eric Sandhusen. I'm president of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County and a board member of the American Ethical Union. Today's American Ethical Union All Societies platform, Saving Democracy with Julia Angwin, comes to you from the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County from our meeting house in Teaneck, New Jersey. Julia Angwin is an award-winning investigative journalist, founder of the nonprofit journalism studio Proof News, a best-selling author, and a New York Times contributing opinion writer. She is a winner and two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in explanatory reporting for her work at the Wall Street Journal and ProPublica. She founded the nonprofit newsroom, The Markup, and she is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Dragnet Nation, A Quest for Privacy, Security, and Freedom in a World of Relentless Surveillance, and Stealing My Space, The Battle to Control the Most Popular Website in America. She earned a B.A. in mathematics from the University of Chicago and an M.B.A. from the Graduate School of Business at Columbia University. She is currently a Walter Shorenstein Media and Democracy Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, and was previously entrepreneur in residence at Columbia Journalism School's Brown Institute for Media Innovation. It's a great honor to welcome Julia for this dialogue, Saving Democracy, a conversation with Julia Angwin. Welcome, Julia.
Julia, thank you for being here. And it's really, as I say, it's a great pleasure. We do have some questions that we've got developed from across the country, but let's start by getting to know you a little bit. I see that, of course, you did your undergraduate work at the University of Chicago. And so the University of Chicago, of course, known for its sort of Chicago school of sort of uber-libertarian, Milton Friedman-esque type of politics, if you will, but also known for Saul Alinsky and other progressive activists, possibly, if you will, Barack Obama. In many ways, shaped and helping to shape that. Tell me about your time there at the University of Chicago and whether or not there was anything particularly formative in that environment, if you will.
You asked about University of Chicago, but I want to start a little bit further back because
Thank you.
I was raised in the heart of the Silicon Valley. And so essentially, I was marinated in libertarianism from the moment I was born, and a real sense that like markets and entrepreneurship could solve everything. And then I went to University of Chicago, which of course also really promotes those beliefs. But I was actually kind of insulated from that because I studied math. I was in the math department. I believed, growing up in Palo Alto, I actually didn't really realize there were other things you could do with your life other than math. I mean, it was sort of the language of technology, right? And so I thought my life choices were hardware or software. I literally felt like those are the two options. I was a software person, just because I wasn't that really good at doing things with my fingers. So, but I wandered my way onto the campus newspaper and got a job there because I knew how to use the software to lay out the page.
Julia, I'm afraid the mic keeps dropping out, so I'm going to ask you to
Okay.
use the hand mic.
So anyway, so I was at University of Chicago, and I would say that honestly the most formative thing there was discovering a life beyond sort of a libertarian viewpoint, an entrepreneurial viewpoint, by joining the newspaper, first just to do layout, but then I realized that there were news articles I could write, and I got really interested in essentially finding the truth. I realized that the thing I loved about math was proofs, like proving things, the elegance of a proof. But I realized journalism was also a proof, right? It was just like, can you prove that this thing happened? What's your evidence? What are the limitations of your findings, right? It's very similar. And so I basically made a choice to pursue truth in a slightly different way at the University of Chicago.
Excellent, interesting. And this kind of segues into some of your early works, right, around privacy and the Dragnet Nation, which is the name of your book, which outlines, again, the assault in many ways on privacy. Now, I'll say, you might not know, I'm a privacy officer for a large healthcare corporation. And so one of the things that I have found is that there's a wide range of what I call the privacy quotient, right? From people who say, I remove the labels from my prescription bottles before throwing them out, on the one hand, to those who say, I'm live streaming my colonoscopy, on the other hand. So given this sort of wide range of how people react to privacy, will you talk a little bit about the assault on privacy that we're seeing in this country, the threats to privacy that exist?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was, I finished Chicago. I was like starting my journalism career. And early on in that, the technology.com boom happened. And so I was sort of well positioned to become a technology reporter. And I started to write about the tech industry at the Wall Street Journal, and I realized at a certain point that there was a real challenge a change in the business model, right? When I was growing up, software was sold in a box, shrink wrapped on at a store. I think you probably all remember this, and it cost money. And ultimately, the rise of social networking, we call it social networking, was actually just free software. It was like you can set up your own website without having to buy software. It was hosting and development, essentially, for free. And the way they were monetizing it was by selling your data. So in 2014, I wrote a book called Dragnet Nation about how all of our data was being swept up in these dragnets in ways that were really going to be dangerous for society. And the thing that is so funny about that book, I went back and looked at the reviews. 2014, all the reviews were like, this lady's kind of hysterical. Like, she's really going crazy. She's so worried about stuff. And actually, that book was under paranoid. Everything is worse than I predicted. And so it has all happened so much faster and been so much more extreme, powered by really two things that I think are really, really important, which is facial recognition got online really fast and became really good, and location tracking. Those two things are so invasive and so terrifying. Like, any dictator around the world has been basically wanted to track dissidents and people, their enemies' locations, right? This is the dream of all oppressive regimes, right? And the fact that they're both just available at the flip of a switch is a really terrifying moment. Now, you did ask me about the people's personal feelings about privacy, right? And I think actually I'd like to draw a distinction between people's personal behavior and the collective harm to society that we face. Because actually, I think there's lots of empowering things that have happened as a result of people being able to share their views on social networks and find like-minded communities. All of that has been quite wonderful in a lot of ways. I mean, there's definitely some bad parts, right? Some bad people found community with other bad people, and then they became badder. But largely, it's been a good thing. And I really don't think that privacy is a question about individual decisions. Privacy is about power. If somebody has information about you, they have power over you. Anyone who's ever bought a car knows that. You walk onto the lot, they're trying to figure out how much you can afford to pay, right? This is a negotiation. Data and information is just currency for power. And so what I worry about with privacy is not so much about whether you want to live stream your colonoscopy, which is like, God bless, if you want to, go for it. I worry about the state or some of these companies that are larger and more powerful than states having information over us that they can use to manipulate us, control us, prosecute us, harass us, criminalize us, right? And we are seeing that right now, right? With the immigrant detentions, which are illegal and are using data that is, the IRS had said would never be used for anything other than your taxes. they signed a deal to allow ICE to get that data. So this is an abuse of our data to harass and illegally detain people, which is exactly the kind of thing that you worry about when you're talking about privacy harms.
Thank you so much. And this, we're gonna talk a little bit about your most recent article in the New Yorker. So you want to be a dissident, but before we get there, I want to follow up on what you just said, because I don't know if it was your most recent column in the Times, but it was in April. Your column in the Times was about Doge.
Oh yes.
And the access that Elon Musk and the Doge team now have to a broad swath of what was supposedly government protected data, protected private information.
Yeah.
Would you speak to that and how that may affect
Yeah.
us?
So I write a monthly piece for the New York Times opinion page, and I wrote about Doge's attack on all of the data in the government. So the way the government in the US has chosen to protect privacy has essentially been by siloing data. So IRS is not supposed to share with DHS, who is not supposed to share with NSA. You know, everybody has their pot and they have to use it for the purpose for which it was collected and under the terms under which it was collected. And this is because of a law passed in 1974, the Federal Privacy Act. It was essentially post-Watergate reforms. They were looking to make sure that the government was not abusing its power. And we have operated under that rule forever. And Doge just broke it. They literally just walked into each agency, took the data. There's a whistleblower who's come forward, who's brought information to the Democratic lawmakers on the House Oversight Committee, who said that essentially the Doge employees, or we don't even know if they're employees, contractors, whoever they are going into these agencies, downloading information onto laptops, and they have backpacks full of laptops from all the different agencies, and they're then feeding that into some sort of master database. This is... The courts continue to find this illegal. Many of these cases are still pending because the way the courts work is slow. And so, unfortunately, this activity continues even as court rulings are slowly coming in. The thing that's very sad and disappointing about the Federal Privacy Act is it doesn't really have great remedies. So when the courts say you're violating the Privacy Act, they basically say, okay, you have to come into compliance. So two really big rulings came recently on Treasury data and Social Security data, both extremely valuable types of data that Doge has taken. And the courts, ultimately, the remedy that they proposed for the violation of the law was that the Doge employees had to get training. So we need this law to be revised and have more actual penalties in it. And there's a bill that Senator Wyden has proposed to update the Federal Privacy Act, but this is where we're at, where they're building a master database, the likes of which people in the past have envisioned and deliberately said they did not want, and it's happening. So I'm sorry to tell you that.
Thank you. I'm sorry to hear it as well, but I mean, it's important to know because obviously, as you said, information is power and potentially power over in many ways. And, you know, they may mandate training, and of course, as a privacy person, I know that training is in keeping information private, making sure it's not disclosed without authorization and things like that. But a database of 300 million people can easily be copied, right? And we're not talking about reams and reams of paperwork anymore. We're talking about data files that can be massive and that still, even with their size, can be held on a thumb drive.
And I think many people are worried that, actually, cybersecurity experts will tell you it's already been exfiltrated by other nation states for sure. And it may well have been taken by these individuals. Elon Musk could have taken it to his own, to feed into his AI system. We don't know, right? But the truth is, if you're carrying data around in laptops in backpacks, you are not following proper cybersecurity procedures. And there are a lot of adversaries out there who are going to get that data.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, the threats I can see, right? They come from both within and without, if you will. And so let's talk for a moment, not so much about those external threats that come from what may be transnational corporations or rogue or criminal states, but from our own government. And I personally have some real concerns as to the commitment of this current administration to the rule of law and to due process. Am I understating things? But clearly, it requires a response. And this takes me to the article that you published in the New Yorker. And we're going to go to, again, our societies around the country to talk a little bit more about this. But your recent article was, So You Want to Be a Dissident. And in this article, you really laid out some great research and some empirical evidence from successful resistance movements around the world and in this country. I'd like to ask you, what's the story of the story, if you will? I mean, to me, it's a very important article that was published. And so it seems to me like there's a story behind it.
Yes, there is a story behind it. The morning after the presidential election, I woke up and I was upset. And I like to channel my upsetness into something productive. And I couldn't get this thought out of my head, which was that I had written this book, Dragnet Nation, about largely a scenario where the collector of data that we need to be most worried about was big tech, and we were worried about the government dipping its hand into that pot, right? And I just woke up with this thought: the threat model I have been using is wrong, right? That is not the threat in a techno-authoritarian regime. It's part of the threat, but the actual threat is the government itself. And it's not that I didn't acknowledge that in the book. I obviously talked about the NSA and this and that, but the reality is that we have some of the best protections against domestic spying of any Western nation. Most countries don't have any checks on their domestic spying capacities. They also don't have the level of technical spying capacity that we have. But I thought, holy moly, here we are. How, I don't know if you remember Edward Snowden, and he came forward with all these files about what the NSA was doing, and he said, this is turnkey totalitarianism. And I woke up the morning after the election, I said, are they going to turn the key, right? Because that is terrifying. And so what I decided to do was call dissidents in other authoritarian regimes and say, what do we need to be prepared for? Because threat modeling is a word we use in the privacy community, which is like, you can't protect yourself against everything. So what threats are you worried about, and how do you protect yourself against those, right? And so I basically wanted to talk to all these dissidents about how to protect yourself in a regime that is going to choose to use the information it has on its citizens to repress dissent. Because our president ran on that as a platform, right? Like, that was not a secret agenda. That was a campaign promise. And so I started calling all these dissidents, and I realized that there was more to their stories, I mean, obviously, than just how to protect yourself. And in fact, many of them told me, like, part of doing this is knowing that you can't protect yourself, but you do it anyways. And so you can take some reasonable measures. And so that's why this piece became more than just how to protect yourself, but really how to effectively challenge an authoritarian regime. And it turns out there are lots of techniques out there and that have been proven to work. Now, past success is never an indication of the future success, but it's actually kind of a hopeful story that authoritarian regimes can be challenged, have been challenged successfully over and over and over history.
Thank you. And that's what really struck me about that article, was that it really did it really put out a positive tone of, yes, there are playbooks
Yes.
that have been followed around the world and throughout history. Again, whether it was in the Soviet Union, whether it was in the Balkans against Slobodan Milosevic,
Yep.
And so many others. Which brings us to where we are today, right? Where we're, recently within the last 2 weeks, we saw some really extensive protests. The No King's Day brought out millions of people across the country with thousands of different actions. So, will you talk a little bit about that, about how No King's Day, what that means in the context of standing up to this authoritarian tendency?
Absolutely. So, one of the things I thought was most surprising in my journey into understanding protest movements was that the value of street protest is actually in assuring other people that there are people who have the same beliefs. I didn't quite understand that before. I thought the protest itself on the street was its own thing, which it is. But really, movement organizers told me over and over again the reason you do that is to make other people realize, oh, the doubts I'm having, other people share those concerns too, and ignite what they call a belief cascade so that you realize, oh, it's okay to have this belief because other people have this belief. And so the turnout for these things is in some ways just gives people more permission to say, oh, you know what? I don't want to comply with these immoral, unjust things that are being asked of me and of our nation, right? And so essentially what I learned is that the movements succeed when they are broad based and have a huge amount of participation. There's this rule, the 3.5% rule, which is if you get 3.5% of the population to do sustained um, non cooperation with the regime, which can be an economic strike, boycotts, protests, etc. Um, that is what essentially most regimes cannot withstand that and they fall. And so the question is, how do you get to 3.5%? You convince people that they can be part of it. And so no kings and things like that are a way to say, hey, there's a lot of other people who feel this way. Let's all act together. But it takes more than just a day of street protest. It really takes the most powerful way to withdraw consent from a regime is to actually have people not cooperate with its orders. So, for instance, you saw that, like, in some of these agencies, when Doge shows up illegally, the employees will stand at the door and say, you can't come in, right? The Librarian of Congress was illegally fired. And when the president installed a new one illegally, the employees said, no, you can't come in, right? These acts of non cooperation, I will not comply with immoral, illegal acts, are how you deny a regime the ability to operate. And so the more and more of those that happen, the more effective the ineffective the regime becomes, and the more that people can regain power.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite our Zoom coordinator to reach out to one of our societies online.
What I really want to say is the police and the editor of the newspaper, even though they are very much on the other side of the fence from us politically, have really stepped up and been very professional. And it is possible to disagree without losing our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Trish. So, Julia, what Trish just shared, I think raises a good question for us, right? Which is that we want to stand in opposition, but we don't necessarily want to create enemies out of what could be potential friends or allies, right? Whether that's in the media, whether that's in the local police, whether that's in federal office, right? I mean, where do we draw that line? How do we walk that line, perhaps?
That's such a good question. And, I go back to the Soviet dissidents for this. So the Soviet dissident, the word dissident really kind of arose around descriptions of the Soviet dissidents. Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, you probably know all these names. They actually were not fighting the regime. They were not asking for regime change. They were asking for the government to follow the very beautiful constitution it had written after the revolution, which guaranteed all sorts of rights. And none of those rights were being actually allowed. And so I think it's a very similar situation right now where what the things people want are due process. They want rule of law. They want the Constitution to be followed. And so I think that is the kind of message that brings in a big tent, right? You don't have to be against this particular president, whatever. This isn't a personality thing. This is about our country. We all agreed on this document, decided we were into it, and like we want to follow it. I was recently in Poland and it was Constitution Day. They have a celebration. Everybody stopped work and all day they were gathered in squares singing songs about their constitution. And I thought, gosh, we should do that because we're so personality driven, right? But actually, when you listen to the people who have defected from the Republican Party, that's what they're saying. They're saying we want the things that are in there. We want free speech. We want due process. We want all the things that we all agreed upon, And so I think that is the message we need to all have as a big umbrella for this movement to really what we all want is our rights.
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate really that kind of a comment, right? To find where is this common ground that we can develop. Because if we're going to get to 3.5%, we are going to have a much larger tent.
Yes. And oh, by the way, I'm going to do a small plug because I just sold a
good.
book based on this New Yorker article. So it'll be coming out next year. I'm researching and writing it, but it's going to say all these things and then you can give it to your friends.
Excellent. Well, maybe we'll look to have you back after it's published. So let's invite Jill.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Jill.
I come to you from the Mid Rivers Ethical Society, which is in the St. Louis area, a little bit west of St. Louis. I understand that you've written about communal trainings for nonviolent action. And so I just wanted to share that one of the things that we're really focusing hard on this year, thanks to our Ethical Action Committee Chair, Linda Martin, who is here today as well, we're working to expand the St. Louis Photo ID project into our county. We're in St. Charles County, which is a very conservative county. And we recognize how important it is for folks to be able to obtain a photo ID, not just so that they can vote in the next election, but there are so many other reasons why folks need to have a photo ID in terms of being able to secure a place to live and get a job and obtain health care and things like that. So we're really excited about that. And we definitely see it as an ethical action. We'll be having a clinic at our space at our building twice a week, and it's on track to go active this fall. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jill. That's good work, and I think that's something that we can also take a look at here as a way to engage in more direct services and benefits to people who need them. But in your article, Julia, you talked about the kind of common training, and training not just being a way of getting knowledge to people, but as a real organizing model.
Yeah, I think one of the things I learned in looking at the past is that some of the most successful movements, and I would say the civil rights movement in the United States being one of them, invested a lot in training. And training, you can do a lot of different types of training, but I think the type of training I want to talk about is how to engage in nonviolent protest, because the data shows that violent actions are half as effective as nonviolent, and nonviolent protest is really the gold standard for achieving your aims. As we've seen, accusations that the protesters were violent were why the president called the Marines to LA. Those were unfounded allegations, but the reality is any amount of violence allows the state to justify its repressive tactics. And so learning how to be nonviolent when somebody is enacting violence on you is actually quite difficult. And so in the civil rights era, they had really impressive training to learn how to not respond. You know, obviously Gandhi in India also was like a master of this. And this is something, a technique that we are going to have to learn again because it's clear that the way this information war is going to happen about is that the protesters are violent, and so nonviolent trainings are happening all around, and they're really important for people who are going to go to street protest. If you're going to do other types of actions like economic boycotts and things like that, it's not as important. Although they are trying to make those illegal too. But but it is important to understand how to engage in these types of activities because we are not well versed in them. If we go to France, they just go on strike every other day. They're really good at it. They know how to do it. It's not, you know what I mean? Like they just grow up with that. And we haven't really had to fight as hard for our rights as they have gotten used to, and we're going to have to start learning to do that more.
Thank you. Yeah, well, those types of actions, they involve risk.
Yes.
And you talked a little bit about risk in your article, right?
Yeah.
And what it means to take a risk, especially now where that type of activity can result in loss of job, loss of freedom, all kinds of loss of privacy, loss of the ability to be a private person and not be, kind of splashed across the media in various memes and things like that. Talk to us a little bit about the risks and that risk-taking decision, if you will.
Yeah. I think that there's a little bit of a misconception that if you don't do anything, then you're not at risk. And if you do something, you are at risk. But we are all at risk, right? If all of our rights are gone, if due process is no longer the case, everyone and anyone can be disappeared, right? Right now, they're targeting the most vulnerable people, immigrants, some of whom don't have papers, right? That's the easiest, right? But we know that when states get into repression, they are going to take people who are political dissidents. They're going to take their political enemies. They're going to take journalists. They're going to take anyone who wants to say something that they don't want said. And so the reality is that people make a little risk calculation like, oh, I'm going to be fine if I just keep my head down. But you're really not because you're going to be living in a police state. And that's not a fine way to live. And so I think one of the things is if we all can take a small risk now, everyone takes a little risk, we can prevent that bigger risk in the future. But that's a really hard thing for Americans because that is about collective action. That's about thinking of yourself as part of a collective. And we are in a cult of individuality, right? That's one of the things that makes America great and terrible. And so we have to recognize that this is a moment for thinking collectively, that if we each take a small risk honestly, like for instance, I know it's inconceivable, but a general strike is the gold standard. That is the thing that regimes cannot withstand, right? The Polish solidarity movement is considered the peak because the way they turned on the general strike, they would shut down the country. And then when the regime gave them what they wanted, they turn it back on. And then they backtrack, they turn it off again, right? And that actually is a really effective tactic, but it requires coordination and collective action and everyone taking a small risk together. And so I think that's the kind of thinking that I think Americans need to start thinking about more because you're taking a risk either way. And one of them is a little more short term, one's longer term. But in the end, nobody wants to live in a police state.
Thank you.
Well, he wants to ask, several weeks back when the city controller, Brad Lander, ended up in immigration court and objected to ICE agents. When Lander himself was detained, do you think this turned public opinion further against DOJ and ICE? And have ICE agents refrained from arresting, or might they have refrained from arresting him if more New Yorkers had been on hand to protest at that?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think the Brad Landers arrest was a perfect example of the kind of thing that ignites a belief cascade. So essentially, he was escorting an immigrant in or out of court. I can't remember. And these ICE agents tried to detain that immigrant, but they did not have a warrant. They did not have any legal standing to do that. And so he objected and he was arrested, as was the immigrant. And because was running for mayor and is a well-known politician in New York, it got a lot of coverage. And what it did was just put a human face on something that's happening every day, right? And made more people realize, like, this is unjust. I don't want this to happen. And now I'm seeing this nice dad who lives in Park Slope being arrested, and he seems like a good guy. And this is how these stories actually gain salience, is when you can see yourself in that person. And that's how human brains work. We need a story and a face to these things that otherwise can seem really abstract. And so I do think that that probably brought more people to a feeling of like, oh, I'm not okay with these types of detentions. And so it was probably worth it, in the movement speak, it was like an action that was worth it. It had a good return on investment. And we've definitely seen that in so many videos that maybe all of you have seen on social media, where communities will come out to protect an immigrant as the ICE agents are trying to show up. And if there's enough people, they can actually deter them from doing the arrest. And so there's a lot of collective action that really can make a difference and really uphold the rights of people who deserve due process.
Thank you. We saw at Delaney Hall a couple of weeks back, a state assemblywoman, member of Congress, who was arrested. And, you spoke about nonviolence, and here was this elected official who was standing there, and essentially, because she was pushed and didn't immediately go boneless, right? They arrested her and charged her with resisting, as I recall, right? Some form of assaulting an ICE officer.
I believe they charged Brad Lander with assaulting an ICE officer too. So that's when I was talking before about practicing nonviolence, it's really important. The reason nonviolence is an effective tactic is because it reveals the state repression for what it is. That asymmetry of them pointing guns and wearing all these masks and these harmless, unarmed people not resisting is the image that turns people against the state. That's how you get to 3.5%. You show people how the state is acting. And so the fact that witnesses videotaped those things is so important, right? That actually makes their claims that that the officers were assaulted, completely impossible to prove, right? And same thing with the member of Congress, right? So one thing that's really important thing that all of us can do is witnessing. So there's a lot of groups out there across the country who are really just seeking to witness ICE actions and to film them, because that is the most important thing to prove to the public the injustice that's happening. There's a group up in Massachusetts that we wrote about in the New Yorker piece. What they did is, after the Tufts student was arrested, they went and knocked on every single door in the neighborhood till they found that camera footage. And then that footage of her is what told the story. No one can forget watching that poor girl just walking down the street, being surrounded by all these weird masked men in their unmarked van, right? And so witnessing these events is all of our duties as a citizen. And it's interesting because as a journalist, we used to think that we were the ones who had to witness these things. And if we weren't there, it didn't get witnessed. Now everybody can be a witness. And so it's actually democratizing that accountability that we all need to do as citizens.
Fantastic. Yes, Lisa, go ahead. If you want to take the mic. So
At Delaney Hall, that's exactly what we're doing. The primary purpose is bearing witness and just taking videos. But I'm thinking we should take it to the courthouses.
Yeah. I mean, the more witness, the better, in my opinion. So, as journalists, we're basically, journalism is also collapsing. You may have heard financially, destroyed and falling apart. So we need everybody to get into the witness business.
That's great. Thank you. And we have Sarah Morris in our the Washington Ethical Society. Hi, Sarah. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to talk for a minute about the role of government employees, and then my trustee colleague Jenna Umbriak is going to describe some of the things that Wes is doing to live into our values in this moment. Thank you so much for this really important conversation. So as far as government employees, and of course, to emphasize, this is really salient to us here in Washington, but of course, there are federal government employees all over the country, not only in DC. It's a real challenge to balance our role as employees and also as citizens who want to be dissidents. So speaking for myself, I'm being instructed at my work to do unethical things. And I have to grapple every day with what is my line that I won't cross. I love my job. I don't want to leave my job. I want to stick it out. But it's getting harder and harder all the time. One thing that folks at NIH did, employees at NIH did, is organize a statement of dissent called the Bethesda Declaration. And many of us signed it, which feels risky. And it has been distributed and gotten some media coverage and was sent to leadership in Congress that has oversight over the NIH. And that Bethesda Declaration was released several weeks ago, and NIH leadership is just now offering to meet with a subset of the signers. So it's yet to be known whether this statement of dissent will have any impact on how NIH is being run. Apparently, other government agencies are taking the Bethesda Declaration as a model and drafting their own statements of dissent. So that's encouraging. Yeah. So
Great.
many government employees want to protest, but we're worried about ending up on the front page of the Washington Post. We want to speak out and contact reporters and tell them what the heck is going on, but doing so is really scary. So those are some of the issues that we are grappling with. I can pause there and then let Jenna talk about some other things.
Thank you. Yeah, Julia, would you like to? We have someone else?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, hi, Jenna.
Hi, I'll be quick. But I appreciate this conversation and I'm curious, Julie, if you have specific ways to answer the question of how can we as societies promote this belief cascade that you're talking about and kind of create this 3.5% and challenge the cult of individuality. And just a few of the ways that I think we're doing it at West right now. One is to just try to be as visible as possible and to say, if you are interested in being part of a community of current and would-be dissidents, we're here. You know, we put the largest progressive pride flag I think I've ever seen on the facade of our building, which is on a major thoroughfare here, as in a way to say, sort of a beacon, like, come and join us and we'll do this thing together. We've created a simpler version of our website to share with people who I think are particularly looking for a community of dissidents right now, and to say, you may not know what ethical society or didn't know what ethical societies were beforehand, but this is a place for you to be and to act against this regime. We've been reaching out to the Jewish and Muslim congregations that share our space and trying to join together with them in certain actions and in community. Trying to be more engaged in with other organizations, I think, to just be out there, to be at festivals, to be at protests together with our t-shirts on saying, ethical societies do this. We've been doing this for a while, and we're doing this in a particularly new and robust way because of our reaction to what's going on. So those are just some ways we've been trying to act in that way, but I'm curious if there's anything else that you would recommend. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That was a very impressive amount of work you're already doing there. And I do want to say, like, federal employees right now are really, every one of them is beleaguered, and every day that they continue to do their work, they're being brave and courageous. And I want to give a real shout out to everyone doing this work in such terrible conditions. I have one of my friends who's in the federal government. I constantly make dinner for, because I'm just like, okay, I just like, at least I can feed you. You know, that's like one thing I can do to help. But I want to start with the first question, which was, how do we keep ourselves safe? And then I'll talk more about what actions might be possible. But just because I haven't spent enough time on that, there are some, even though I said in the beginning, like, you can't really perfectly keep yourself safe, you can do better than nothing, you know? And so some, excuse me,
There's water.
some principles that are really important in keeping yourself safe. One of the most important principles is compartmentalization. So if you're a federal worker, or you need to have a personal phone and a work phone, you need those devices to be separate. Same thing with your computers, because if there's going to be an unjust investigation of you, for your total right to free speech, you want only your work devices to be swept up in that, and your personal devices to be separate. And the time to do that is before you're investigated, because once you're investigated, you can't set up two regimes. So I have a lot of friends who unfortunately have been swept into such investigations and didn't do the compartmentalization and are regretting it. So that is item one. Item two is, it's really important to understand use encryption. So basically, if you don't use Signal or WhatsApp, which are encrypted messaging programs, you need to start doing that right now with all of the people that you're communicating with. One thing that's really important when you're talking about leaking to journalists, if you see something that you think a journalist needs to see, you need to take a picture of it using the camera inside the Signal app. If you take it on your phone camera, there will be a photo of it on your camera roll. If you take it inside Signal, there's no trace. And then you just send that directly through Signal to the reporter whose Signal you have. Almost every reporter these days is putting their Signal ID in their bio or something. And so you can find it and just send them a photo of a document, and then set that chat to disappearing messages of 1 week. And then that's it. So there are some best practices out there that I want to encourage people to use, which is compartmentalize your data, encrypt your data, don't leave any traces behind. Now, that said, there are a lot of people who say, you know what? I don't want to hide anything. I want it to be in the open. The Soviet dissidents refused to keep anything secret, published everything. That's also fair. Navalny, similarly, right? Alexei Navalny, who unfortunately was murdered by the Russian regime recently, but he also believed, you know what? I don't want to have secrets. But he wasn't stupid. He carried a burner phone. He had no data on it, right? So you have to always be smart about how thinking through these strategies. And the sad thing is that, you know, we're all going to be dissidents eventually, because by speaking of it, this is a regime that has made it clear that if you oppose them, you are an enemy, right? And so anyone who has a disagreement with a government, I can't think of a single government that I haven't had a disagreement with, right? Left, right, center, whatever. So we're all going to be dissidents. So it's important to start thinking strategically about just compartmentalizing some of that, of your political dissent, into encrypted channels, trusted people, etc. And then with the question on tactics from the Washington group, I think honestly it sounds like you're doing everything you should be doing. The most important thing really is to build coalitions. So if you're a group and you're doing great, find another group, join forces, then get another group, right? And like, the bigger the tent, the better. And so ultimately, these movements are all about the broadest tent. There's a line in movement building where they say, if you're not in coalition with people you hate, you are not in coalition, right? So you must be in a group with people who you actually despise. So go find some people you despise and get in community with them.
Wow. Wow.
Sorry.
Easier said than done, I think. But really, no, that's good advice, right? To have that type of broad coalition. But it does raise for me kind of a question and even a concern, right? Because what that tends to do is perhaps the coalition then becomes painted by the most extreme member of that, right? And so, whereas under a larger tent, when we look at police brutality, shall we say, right, we can say our goal is police professionalism, accountability, and justice, right? But what we end up with is defund the police, and we're seeing that now even Zoran Mamdani is trying to work against that label that's been he's been attached to him in that way. And so how do you manage that type of
Yeah, there's always those tensions, right? I mean, I think one thing to remember is every movement will be tarred with these accusations. We have a misty memory of the civil rights movement, but at that time, they were being described as terrorists, right? In mainstream newspapers around the nation. Right now, we're like, oh, it was all so beautiful. No, no, no. People didn't really buy it, right? So you also just have to remember, no matter how good you are, they're going to call you bad. So make your peace with that. But I think it's really important to think about the goal of your movement, right? Like, I'm a journalist, and so theoretically, I'm not, actually designing any of these movements, but I have views, and I think we should just all be uniting around the Constitution, like straight up, like just let's do that shit, excuse my language, but like that's something everyone can get around, right? The problem is when you start picking these sectors, like, okay, I'm only for reproductive justice. I'm for reproductive justice. I'm for trans rights. I'm for trans rights. But you can't have a mass movement around those things. You just have to be like, I want rights for everyone as described in that document we all agreed upon. And that allows you to have a bigger coalition. And yes, they're going to call you names. That is just guaranteed.
Yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, so much of that, what was at one time a political debate, is now carried out as memes.
Yes.
And oftentimes, memes that are really degrading and dehumanizing of both sides, I have to say, right? I see it on the extremes of both sides. How do we bring compassion into that conversation?
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I actually kind of love meme culture. I think that political video commentary is the editorial cartooning of our time. Editorial cartoons back in the day when every newspaper had their own cartoonist, that was the most incisive political commentary because you didn't have to understand the budget bill to see like a picture of an avaricious pig, like digging through your trash to eat all your food or whatever metaphor. I obviously am not going to be an editorial cartoonist because that's probably not a good cartoon idea. But point is, it would describe these injustices in a way that people could understand. I find that the video skits that I see where people make fun of the legislation or the whatever proposals actually are really incredibly incisive political commentary. And I don't think we ever have or should expect the public to be deep into the nuances, right? And so these are wars of persuasion, and wars of persuasion are done through really simple stories. And so I agree, there are some gross ones out there, but let's just make better ones. There's a question in the audience here.
Can I jump in also?
Yeah, Orion, go ahead.
We have a quick note from again from Kurt Collier announcing that the Bergen Society won a grant from the New Jersey Bar Foundation to provide training to congregations on their legal rights and limits of political protest. So something else that's happening here.
And we're so grateful that you came out, Julie. This has really been a very fascinating and interesting conversation.
My pleasure.
First of all, I want to thank some folks for helping to bring this into being, this All Societies platform. I want to give thanks to Dror Khan, who, as the chair of the small but very effective All Societies Planning Committee, planning group, organizes these All Society platforms across the AEU. And these occur whenever there is a fifth Sunday in the month. I am going to give Dror an opportunity to put up the AEU donation slide and script. If you're inspired today or learned something new, or if you'd like to connect with new or lifelong friends, we are going to have some breakout rooms shortly after the end of this program. And again, please do support the AEU All Societies platforms with a donation at that website that was just listed. So thanks to everybody who made this possible. And of course, a special thanks to you, Julia Angwin, for your knowledge, for your insight, and for sharing and being here today.
Thank you so much.
That said, again, if you're willing to stay for a few more questions, we'll be glad to we have a few questions in this.
So Stan Horowitz from, I believe that's the Philadelphia Ethical Society, he asks, does Julia feel that the mainstream news organization, okay. Does Julia feel that the mainstream news organizations are not covering anti-Trump protests adequately? And if so, why? Is it due to a fear of retribution by the Trump administration?
Oh, that's such a good question. I do think that mainstream media generally struggles with how to cover protests. The reason is that the media, and I'm a proud member of it, really it's more designed to write about the ACLU sues, the court ruled, big actors against each other. It's sort of confusing to write about like a Tesla protest, for instance. The Tesla protests have been one of the most effective economic boycotts in American history, right? To bring down the value of this company by at least 30-40% in a few months of protest, to make it basically Tesla owners desperate to sell their cars because it's embarrassing to own one. That is a very impressive economic boycott. But each Tesla protest itself might just be 30 people at a Tesla dealership for a few hours on a Saturday. And so it, like, from a news organization traditional thinking, it's like, is that as important as like the fire that we had to cover that day because there was a fire or there was a thing that happened? And so the truth is that protests are like often a disparate movement. Sometimes on a day like No Kings, I think it's kind of inexcusable how the media didn't cover that, because that was like millions and millions of people and it really deserved more coverage. But in general, I would just say that the media struggles to understand how to cover protests. And I would say I myself did too. Until I started reading and understanding movements, I didn't really understand what the value of protest was. Once I understood that it was to encourage other defectors, I now can put it in the proper context. But I think that journalists just generally are under-resourced, overstressed, and have 10 things they have to cover each day. And if there's 30 people somewhere, they may not want to do it.
We do have another question in the chat window. Sylvia Acosta asks, Elissa Slotkin, a Democrat from Michigan, spoke very powerfully at the Center for American Progress. Can you identify what you feel are other specific actions, such as this, by elected officials that you feel are having a positive impact in our quest for justice? And conversely, what actions by Democratic or nonpartisan voices that are having a negative impact on this quest?
I think one of the Cory Booker's 25-hour speech on the Senate floor was, I think, a perfect example of the kind of thing that ignites a belief cascade. It was pretty early on in the administration, and he was calling out the injustices that he saw. And it made other people comfortable expressing those feelings. Perhaps it only made his other Senate colleagues feel comfortable, but they were an important constituency too, right? And I think that the No Oligarchs tour that Bernie Sanders and AOC have been doing has also been really important in encouraging people to understand that they're not alone in feeling that this is an oligarchy that has taken over our country. And So I think there's a lot of really inspiring things that are happening, actually. One thing that's really interesting is that there are far more protests now than there have ever been, actually. According to a Harvard professor who tracks protests, and so there's actually a lot happening. It's just that it's not always being covered. And some of that is because the media is in such a beleaguered state at the moment.
Okay, from Emil Last. He says, Happy Pride. Question. How do we move the needle on the 3.5% data point as societies? Is there further granular data of the 3.5% by demographics, geolocation, socioeconomic status, etc.? Where do I go to learn more? We are in New York, the Westchester Society. Thank you. That's from Yvonne.
That's such a great question. So the person who studied and found the 3.5% rule is these two, a Harvard professor, Erica Chenoweth, and a movement organizer, Maria Stefan. The two of them wrote a book called Why Civil Resistance Works, which was their manifesto about why nonviolent protest works, and they studied hundreds of protests that either toppled an authoritarian regime or won independence from an oppressive regime from 1900 till current day, and analyzed what tactics worked. And that is where one of the observations they had from studying that data was that actually, if you got 3.5% of a population, no regime was able to withstand that. But there are plenty of successful revolutions that happened with 2% or 2.5%, right? So the 3.5% is not necessarily like a surefire silver bullet. It's more an observation about what's worked in the past. But really their point is that what works is sustained movements that are broad-based and that a lot of different aspects of society participate in. One key thing that happens that is important is the military. If you recall, during the last Trump presidency, he did ask the generals if they would shoot at domestic protesters, and they said no. That was a very important moment. We don't know how the military react in this regime, right? And that has been a crucial moment in many authoritarian regimes. When Slobodan Milosevic asked his troops to fire on the protesters, they said no. And the reason was because at that point, the movement was so large that the military members said, I was worried my kids were in the crowd. I was worried my aunt was in the crowd. I couldn't do it because too many people I knew were part of the protest. So the reason you have a big movement is to essentially make it so that these arms of society that are designed to repress the movement cannot function at repression. So the 3.5% sometimes gets mythologized as like a goal, but the goal is not necessarily that. The goal is a movement so broad that everyone feels like you can't stop it.
Thank you so much. I know we have many, many more questions online, but I know we also have to end it at some point. What I am going to do is I'm going to encourage those of you who are on Zoom to stay on Zoom and join breakout rooms that are going to be set up and take this opportunity to meet with your fellow activists, coordinate activities, coordinate actions, help us come together and build that type of resistance movement that ultimately will prevail and turn the tide against this authoritarian regime and authoritarian tendencies in our country. So with that, I'm going to thank you, Julia, so much for being here. It's a great pleasure.